Welcome to Void Histories, a place where the past is not told in haste, but whispered slowly, like a lullaby for restless minds. Tonight, we step into the quiet shadows of history, into a moment when the land of Bengal, once fertile and full of life, was consumed by hunger and silence. It is called the Bengal Famine of 1943, a colonial catastrophe. This is not only a story of numbers, nor merely a record of policies and power. It is the echo of empty fields, the fading voices of children, the weight of grief that still lingers across generations. History is never just about what was, it is about the wounds that remain, the memories that refuse to fade, and the lessons that call out softly to us in the present. So let your thoughts slow down, let the stillness of the story surround you, and stay here with us as we gently trace the forgotten paths of sorrow and resilience together in the quiet of the night. The Bengal famine of 1943, a colonial catastrophe. Before the shadow of empire stretched across the land, Bengal was a place of quiet rhythm, a land breathing in tune with the river and the rains. The mighty Ganges and Brahmaputra carried waters from the mountains to the fertile plains, weaving life into every corner of the countryside. Fields of rice glistened under the sun, bending gently in the wind, as if whispering secrets to the sky. Villages rested among palm groves and mango trees, their clay houses simple but filled with the warmth of family and tradition. There was hardship, yes. Floods sometimes washed away crops, and storms battered the fragile homes. But there was also resilience, a kind of balance that came from knowing the earth, from living with its cycles, and from honoring the spirits of the land. Life here had a rhythm that soothed the soul. The day began with the soft call of birds and the laughter of children running to fetch water from the well. Women gathered in the courtyards, grinding spices that released fragrances both sharp and sweet. Men worked the fields with steady patience, their feet sinking into the wet earth as they planted seedlings with practiced care. In the evenings, lamps glowed in each home, and families gathered to eat rice, lentils, and fish cooked with herbs. The sound of music often carried through the night, songs of devotion, of longing, of celebration. These were not the voices of a wealthy people, but they were the voices of a people who belonged to their land, who found meaning in community, who understood that survival was not only about food, but about culture, memory, and belonging. Bengal was not just a province, it was a world of its own, shaped by centuries of history. Poets had written verses about its rivers, mystics had sung songs that blended faith with philosophy, and traders had carried its silk and muslin across oceans. The land was rich, not only in resources but in spirit, and those who lived there felt connected to something timeless. There was a sense of dignity in the ordinary, the weaving of cloth, the tending of cattle, the offering of flowers in temples. Each small act was a thread in the fabric of Bengal's life, woven tightly enough to seem unbreakable. Yet beneath the beauty of daily life, there was also fragility. The abundance of the land was a blessing, but it also drew the gaze of outsiders. Bengal's rice, its jute, its fertile soil, all these made it a jewel that others longed to control. The people, though resilient, had little preparation for the kind of hunger that could come not from the failure of the earth, but from the decisions of men far away. At this time, they could not imagine that their songs, their fields, and their quiet nights would soon be touched by a catastrophe beyond anything they had known. For now, though, let us linger in the calm before the storm. Picture a child lying beside a grandmother, listening to a story told in a voice as soft as the evening breeze. Picture the stars above the paddy fields, reflected in the water like scattered jewels. Picture the river, moving endlessly, carrying both life and memory. These are the images of Bengal before the famine, before empire turned its gaze fully upon it. This is the memory of a land alive with promise, of people bound to their soil, unaware of how fragile their peace truly was, because soon the stillness of the fields would be broken. Soon the sound of music would be replaced by silence, and soon the fullness of the land would turn to emptiness. The story we tell tonight begins in this world of balance, because only by remembering what was lost can we understand the depth of the wound that followed. And so, as we breathe with Bengal's rivers and walk through its villages in this gentle memory, we prepare ourselves to enter the next chapter, where shadows arrive quietly and where the first threads of harmony begin to unravel. The first arrival of empire was not marked by thunder or conquest, but by something quieter, almost deceptive in its gentleness. At first, the colonizers came as traders, men of the sea bringing goods from distant shores. They came with fabrics and metals, with promises of connection to a wider world, with words that suggested partnership rather than domination. To the people of Bengal, who had long dealt with merchants from Arabia, from China, from beyond the seas, these new faces did not seem so different. Trade was not unusual, and at the beginning, it seemed as though this too would simply be another strand woven into the long history of exchange. But trade has a way of shifting power, of planting seeds that grow into roots, and roots that eventually bind the earth. Slowly, what began as exchange became extraction. The people were told, sometimes gently, sometimes with a tone that allowed no refusal, to grow crops that were not for themselves. Rice fields gave way to indigo, to jute, to opium, plants that had value far away, but left the local granaries empty. The land was fertile, yes, but the fruits of that fertility no longer belonged to the farmers. Grain was counted, measured, taxed, and carried away. What was once a gift of the soil to its people became a commodity controlled by others. The shift was subtle at first. A few changes in the marketplace, a few new demands from tax collectors, a few unfamiliar faces in positions of authority. But with each passing year, the weight grew heavier. The rhythm of the villages, once set by the turning of seasons, was now dictated by distant policies and foreign interests. The people felt it in small ways at first, in the meals that grew lighter, in the debts that grew harder to pay, in the silence that followed when questions were asked too loudly. It is in these small changes that empires take hold, not with grand battles alone, but with policies, with contracts, with the reshaping of daily life, until a people no longer realize how much has been taken from them. For Bengal, this meant a slow erosion of self-sufficiency. The songs continued, the lamp still burned in the evenings, but underneath there was a quiet unease, a sense that the balance of generations was being disturbed. The people who had once fed themselves from their own soil were now caught in the grip of markets they did not control. And then, as time passed, the foreign presence began to reveal its true form. Soldiers arrived not only to protect trade, but to enforce it. Laws were written in a language not their own, handed down with authority that could not be questioned. The gentle promises of partnership gave way to the firm demands of power. Where once there was trust in the cycles of nature, now there was fear of the tax collector's shadow, of the soldier's march, of the policies that decided whether a family ate or starved. It was in these years that the people of Bengal began to understand that what had entered their land was not simply trade, but something far heavier, something that would sink its roots deep into the soil of their lives. They saw how their harvests no longer belonged to them, how their choices were no longer their own. And though the famine had not yet come, Its seeds were already being planted, watered by greed, nurtured by distant ambition, and hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. Still, many did not yet see the full picture. They lived each day as best they could, caring for families, tending fields, holding on to their traditions. Hope remained, though faint. Perhaps the change would not be so severe. Perhaps their lives could continue in balance. But history tells us otherwise. For in the quiet spaces of empire's arrival, the first cracks had already appeared, and soon those cracks would widen into wounds, as the people of Bengal found themselves drawn into struggles they could not escape. When a people are pressed down, when the weight of injustice begins to touch even the smallest corners of daily life, something within the human spirit stirs. In Bengal, that stirring began quietly. It was the murmur of conversations at the edge of fields, the whisper of questions in the crowded bazaars, the cautious look exchanged between neighbors when tax collectors passed. These small currents of unease slowly gathered strength, becoming something larger, something that could no longer be ignored. The first resistance was not always loud or violent. It was often subtle, an act of defiance hidden within ordinary life. A farmer refusing to plant indigo where rice should grow. A family keeping back a handful of grain despite the orders to surrender it. A village closing its gates at night, protecting its stores from outsiders. These were small gestures, but each one carried within it the seed of defiance, the quiet refusal to allow life to be entirely dictated by foreign hands. But as the presence of the colonizers deepened, so too did the anger of the people. Voices rose, sometimes in protest, sometimes in prayer, demanding that the balance of life be restored. Leaders emerged, not always trained soldiers, but men and women whose pain had turned into courage. They spoke of dignity, of the right to harvest one's own field, of the injustice of sending food away while children went hungry. Their words spread like wind across the villages, stirring hearts that had long been silent. And so, the first clashes began. They were uneven struggles, farmers armed with sticks and blades facing soldiers with rifles, villagers defending their granaries against battalions of trained men. Each battle, though often ending in loss, carried with it a message. The people of Bengal would not surrender without struggle. The earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of these confrontations, as if the land knew the sorrow of its children being struck down upon its soil. The empire responded with the cold efficiency of power. Punishments were swift, taxes increased, and those suspected of rebellion faced imprisonment, or worse. Families watched fathers taken away, never to return. Villages were burned as warnings, their smoke rising like silent cries into the night sky. Fear settled over Bengal like a mist, creeping into every home, every field, every conversation. Yet even in this fear, the spirit of resistance remained, flickering like a hidden flame that could not be extinguished. The cracks in the empire's promises were becoming clear. The dream of partnership had dissolved, replaced by the harsh reality of domination. The people saw that the balance they had once known was shattered, and that survival under foreign rule meant living with injustice as a part of everyday life. This realization was painful, for it meant that the peace they longed for was no longer within reach. It meant that their children would grow up in a world where dignity was rationed, where freedom was a memory, where hunger was not only the absence of food, but the absence of hope. Still, the resistance carried meaning, even in defeat. Each act of defiance was a reminder that the human spirit bends but does not break. Each protest, each refusal, each clash left a mark upon the history of Bengal, a mark that said, "We did not surrender easily." These early struggles, though costly, laid the foundation for the memory of resilience that would endure long after the famine came. For the famine was not born only of failed harvests or distant wars, it was born of these cracks, of the deepening imbalance between ruler and ruled, the widening gulf between those who had power and those who had none. The resistance revealed these truths, pulling away the mask of benevolence the empire had once worn, and so Bengal entered a darker season where rebellion was met with repression, where dignity was traded for survival, and where each act of resistance seemed only to invite greater punishment. These were the first cracks, the first wounds, and they would soon widen into something far more devastating. As the years passed, the story of Bengal grew heavier. What had begun as scattered resistance soon gave way to larger struggles, shaped not only by the cries of the villages, but by the storms of war that stretched across the world. The empire was vast, and its needs were endless. Bengal, with its fertile soil and countless hands, became a storehouse for distant ambitions, a field where the seeds of empire survival were planted, even as the people themselves began to wither. The Second World War cast its shadow over every corner of the colony. Troops marched through the villages, ships carried away rice and jute, and the countryside was pulled into a struggle that was never truly its own. The demands of war were heavy. Food diverted to soldiers abroad, grain requisitioned to feed armies thousands of miles away, while local markets stood empty. Warehouses filled with rice were locked and guarded, their bounty inaccessible to the very people who had grown it. Families stood at the gates, hungry, while guards turned them away in silence. Policies were written not with compassion, but with calculation. Agreements signed in distant halls dictated the lives of millions who never saw the ink on the page. These agreements bound Bengal more tightly to the empire, stripping it of choice, forcing it to supply resources at any cost. Officials insisted that such measures were necessary for victory, for survival in a world at war. But for the people of Bengal, survival became something far more immediate. How to endure each day with empty stomachs, how to keep children alive when the fields no longer yielded food for them. The wars and the treaties that followed left little room for dignity. They were not designed to protect the people, but to protect the empire's hold. Grain exports continued even as hunger spread. Relief promised was delayed, diminished, or denied. Local leaders who pleaded for aid found their voices drowned out by the machinery of war. And so, the agreements that were meant to stabilize instead deepened the fracture, binding Bengal not in partnership, but in chains. It is difficult to imagine the despair of those years, to walk through a marketplace where the stalls were bare, where the sound of bargaining had been replaced by silence, to pass fields where rice once grew thick, now standing empty or replaced by crops meant for trade, not for nourishment, to hear the faint cries of hunger echo through the villages at night, knowing that warehouses stood full, their doors locked. These were not natural disasters. They were the deliberate consequences of policies that valued empire above human life. And yet, the people endured as best they could. Families shared what little they had, stretching handfuls of grain into meals that could feed many mouths. Communities came together in quiet solidarity, even as fear kept them from open protest. The land itself seemed to groan under the weight of its misuse, its bounty stolen, its people betrayed. The resilience of Bengal's people was tested in ways no poem, no story, no memory could fully capture. The famine was not yet at its peak, but it had already begun to take shape. Each treaty, each requisition, each enforced agreement tightened the grip, making survival more fragile. The people began to understand that their suffering was not the result of fate or nature, but of decisions made in distant rooms by men who would never know their hunger. And that understanding brought with it a sorrow deeper than hunger itself, the sorrow of knowing that they had been abandoned by those who claimed to rule them. And so, Bengal entered the heart of its darkest trial. The wars had taken their toll, the agreements had sealed their fate, and now famine was no longer a distant fear, but an unfolding reality. What followed would not only claim countless lives, but generations of memory, leaving scars that time could never erase. The famine of 1943 did not strike with the suddenness of a storm. It crept slowly, quietly, like a shadow lengthening over the land. At first there was only unease, meals that grew smaller, mothers stretching rice with water, families cutting back with hope that the next harvest would bring relief. But the relief never came. The hunger deepened, and soon it was not only food that was lost, but hope itself. The streets of Bengal became silent witnesses to human suffering. Once, they had been filled with voices of sellers and buyers, with children running barefoot and laughing. Now, they echoed with cries of hunger, faint at first, then weaker still, until silence replaced them. Children with sunken eyes and fragile bodies lay on the roadsides, too weak to move. Mothers held them close, rocking them in vain, whispering lullabies not to put them to sleep, but to ease them into death with gentleness. Fathers searched desperately for grain, selling possessions, begging for scraps, returning home with empty hands. Families that had once worked together in the fields now sat in silence, their strength eroded by starvation. The famine tore through the heart of society, breaking bonds that had been woven over centuries. Communities fractured under the weight of scarcity. Trust gave way to desperation, as neighbors who once shared bread now looked upon each other with fear, afraid that survival for one meant death for another. The social fabric that had bound villages together unraveled thread by thread, leaving people isolated in their grief. Even the temples and mosques, once places of refuge, became haunted by hunger, their prayers rising into skies that offered no mercy. And yet, within this darkness, there were still flickers of compassion. Some gave away what little they had, feeding strangers even as their own children cried with hunger. Stories tell of women boiling leaves, men catching insects, elders refusing food so the young might eat. These small acts of sacrifice did not stop the famine, but they offered brief glimmers of humanity in a world collapsing into despair. Still, even these glimmers could not prevent the tide of death that swept through Bengal. Entire generations were lost. Children who should have grown into farmers, teachers, poets, and dreamers never lived to see adulthood. Mothers who had carried life within them became silent graves of their own unborn children. The famine was not only a tragedy of numbers, though the numbers themselves were staggering. It was a tragedy of possibilities erased, of futures that would never be written. An entire chapter of Bengal's story was torn out, leaving only silence where voices should have been. Those who survived carried the scars within them, scars that did not heal with the return of food. They carried memories of skeletal figures lining the streets, of the smell of death lingering in the air, of the unbearable choice between feeding one child and letting another starve. They carried the guilt of survival, asking themselves why they lived when so many others did not. These wounds seeped into the next generation, shaping the way people saw themselves, their land, and the world. Hunger may have faded, but the trauma remained, echoing through families and shaping destinies long after the famine had ended. The empire, distant and cold, looked upon the suffering with indifference. Officials explained away the hunger as misfortune, as a natural calamity, as the unavoidable price of war. But the people knew otherwise. They knew this famine was man-made, the bitter fruit of decisions that valued empire over human life, and they knew that the pain of these years would remain long after the fields turned green again. And so, Bengal emerged from the famine not healed, but haunted. Its people carried wounds that could not be seen, but that shaped everything that followed. The famine had claimed not only lives, but trust, dignity, and generations of possibility. What remained was a silence heavy with grief. Yet within that silence, the faint whisper of memory, urging the world never to forget. History is not only a record of dates and events, it is a collection of human voices, some loud, some barely whispers, carrying stories of pain, survival, and resilience across time. The famine of Bengal in 1943 is one such voice, a voice often drowned beneath the noise of war and empire, yet one that continues to echo through memory. It was not simply a famine of rice or of harvests lost, it was a famine of justice, of compassion, of humanity itself. As we look back now, we see not only the suffering, but also the silence that surrounded it. The world was at war, and in that vast storm, Bengal's cries seemed small to those far away. But to the mothers who held their starving children, to the fathers who searched in vain for grain, those cries were everything. For them, the famine was not a story, it was their daily reality, each day a test of whether they would see the next sunrise. Colonial rule left behind more than railways, laws, or buildings. It left behind scars etched deep into the lives of ordinary people. Scars that whispered of grain exported while stomachs were empty, of policies written with ink that turned to hunger, of decisions made in distant rooms that cost millions of lives. The famine is remembered not as an accident of nature, but as a wound inflicted by power, deliberate, preventable, and devastating. It asks us to reflect on what happens when human lives are treated as numbers, when profit outweighs dignity, when empire values itself above the people it rules. And yet, within the sorrow, there is also resilience. Bengal did not vanish in the famine. Its people endured. Survivors carried their memories forward, passing them down in quiet conversations and family stories told at night, in the unspoken grief that shaped generations. The land, though scarred, continued to give. Rice grew again, children were born, songs returned to the evenings. Life, though forever changed, found a way to move forward. That is the paradox of history, that even in its darkest hours, the human spirit seeks light. For us today, the famine is more than a chapter of the past. It is a mirror, reflecting the dangers that arise when power goes unchecked, when compassion is silenced, when leaders forget that their duty is to protect the vulnerable. It reminds us that history is not distant, it is alive within us, shaping the way we see justice, governance, and humanity. To remember Bengal is not to dwell in sorrow, but to honor those who suffered, to ensure their silence does not remain forgotten. When we think of Bengal in 1943, let us not imagine only the hunger and the death. Let us imagine also the resilience, the mother who shared her last grain, the child who survived against all odds, the communities that, even in despair, clung to fragments of dignity. Let us remember that history is both wound and warning, sorrow and survival. And so, as this story draws to a close, we return to the silence of the night. Imagine the fields, once barren, now breathing again beneath the moonlight. Imagine the river, carrying away sorrow, carrying also memory. Imagine the stars above Bengal, watching over both the lost and the living, shining softly as if to remind us that no suffering, no matter how vast, is beyond remembrance. Tonight, as we close our eyes, may we carry with us the quiet truth of Bengal's famine, that human suffering should never be ignored, that every voice matters, and that the lessons of history are not meant to weigh us down, but to guide us toward compassion. May the silence of Bengal's lost generations speak to us still, urging us never to forget and never to repeat.